Over 8 million units were manufactured during the final years of the Second World War, each one costing less than the standard-issue boots worn by an ordinary German soldier. Despite this remarkably low production cost, these weapons possessed the capability to penetrate armor plating that conventional artillery pieces could not breach. This was a weapon system so desperate in its conception and so tragic in its ultimate deployment that understanding its full story requires us to look beyond the simple mechanics of destruction and into the darker corners of total war, where nations sacrifice their own people in the final gasps of defeat. The weapon in question emerged from a military situation that had become increasingly dire for the German Reich. By the time Soviet and Allied forces were pushing deep into German territory in the spring of 1945, the streets of Berlin had transformed into landscapes of devastation. Buildings that once stood as monuments to imperial ambition were now nothing more than skeletal remains, their facades crumbling, their windows empty voids staring out onto rubble-strewn avenues. The sound of approaching armor echoed through these ruins, a mechanical grinding that announced the inexorable advance of tanks that represented overwhelming industrial might. Against this tide of steel and fire stood defenders who could scarcely be called soldiers in any traditional sense. These defenders included boys whose voices had not yet deepened, whose bodies had not yet fully matured, alongside men whose hair had turned grey decades earlier, whose backs were bent with age and labour. In their hands they clutched a weapon that appeared almost comically primitive at first glance. It consisted of little more than a hollow steel tube, its construction so basic that it seemed more like plumbing material than military hardware. Balanced precariously atop this tube sat a warhead, positioned like a grotesque hammer waiting to fall upon some unseen anvil. The entire assembly weighed just a few kilograms, light enough for even the weakest person to carry, yet contained within this deceptively simple package was a destructive force that defied its humble appearance. The mechanism of operation was brutally straightforward. A single pull of the trigger would ignite a propellant charge housed within the tube. The resulting detonation would produce a tremendous roar as fire burst backward from the rear of the weapon, scorching the air around the operator, creating a backblast zone of searing heat that could incinerate anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in its path. Simultaneously, this same explosive force would hurl the warhead forward, accelerating it toward its target. Upon impact with armoured plating, the warhead would detonate, creating a focused jet of molten copper that could pierce through the thickest armour that Allied and Soviet factories had managed to produce. The penetration capabilities were extraordinary for such an inexpensive weapon, capable of defeating armour plates measuring over 200 millimeters in thickness. The scale of production was staggering. More than 8 million of these disposable tubes were manufactured and distributed throughout the Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units during the war. This number exceeded the production of tanks, exceeded the production of artillery pieces, exceeded nearly every other weapons system in terms of sheer quantity. Each tube represented a promise, however hollow that promise might have been, that ordinary infantry soldiers could somehow halt the endless tide of armoured vehicles rolling across the European continent toward the heart of Germany. The weapon offered hope, or at least the illusion of hope, that numerical inferiority in tanks and artillery could be compensated for through the mass distribution of these handheld anti-armour devices. Yet this promise came with a terrible price attached, a cost measured not in Reichsmarks, but in human lives and suffering. To effectively employ this weapon required the operator to position themselves dangerously close to their intended target. The effective range varied depending on the specific model, but even the longest range versions demanded that the shooter stand within 100 meters of an enemy tank. The earlier models required even closer approaches, sometimes as near as 30 meters, sometimes even less. At such distances, the operator stood fully exposed to every defensive weapon the tank possessed. Machine guns mounted on the turret and hull could sweep the surrounding area with devastating fire. The tank's main gun, though too slow to track individual infantry at close range, represented a psychological terror all its own. The grinding treads of the vehicle could crush a human body as easily as they crushed rubble and debris. Escape after firing was nearly impossible. The backblast from the weapon revealed the shooter's position instantly, creating a plume of smoke and fire that acted like a beacon announcing their location to every enemy soldier in the vicinity. The nature of urban combat meant that retreat routes were often blocked by rubble, collapsed buildings, or the very terrain that had provided concealment moments before. Machine gun fire could cut down a fleeing soldier before they had taken more than a few steps. Tank crews, enraged by the destruction of their vehicle or the death of their comrades, would systematically sweep the area with concentrated fire, ensuring that the person responsible for the attack would not survive to strike again. This weapon has become familiar to modern audiences through its depiction in films and video games, where it appears as just another piece of military equipment stripped of context and consequence. In these entertainment mediums, the Panzerfaust is simply a tool, an option selected from an inventory menu, a means to achieve an objective within the sanitized framework of fictional warfare. The reality was far removed from these digital representations. The true history of this weapon encompasses themes of desperation that drove its creation, the institutional madness that led to its distribution among children and the elderly, and the human cost of a defensive strategy that relied upon placing untrained civilians in the direct path of armoured warfare. The story begins not in 1945, but several years earlier, when the character of the war on the Eastern Front underwent a fundamental transformation. In the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa, German armoured columns had swept across Soviet territory with what appeared to be unstoppable momentum. The same tactical doctrines and weapon systems that had crushed Polish resistance in weeks and forced French capitulation in months seemed equally effective against Soviet forces. German tank commanders reported engagement after engagement in which their superior tactics and crew training overcame numerical disadvantages. The early months of the Eastern Campaign created an impression of inevitable victory, a belief that Soviet military capability would crumble under sustained pressure just as other opponents had done. This impression was shattered by the reality that emerged during the winter of 1941 and throughout 1942. The Soviet Union began deploying tanks that represented a qualitative leap beyond anything German forces had previously encountered. The T-34 medium tank combined several revolutionary design features that made it extraordinarily difficult to destroy. Its sloped armor plating meant that incoming rounds struck at oblique angles, increasing the effective thickness of the protection and often causing shells to ricochet harmlessly away. The tank's wide tracks distributed its weight effectively, allowing it to traverse terrain that would bog down German vehicles. Its diesel engine was more reliable in extreme cold than the gasoline engines used in many German tanks. Perhaps most importantly, the T-34 was designed for mass production, with tolerances and manufacturing processes that allowed Soviet factories to produce them in enormous quantities, even while being evacuated eastward away from the advancing German army. Even more formidable was the KV-1 heavy tank, a behemoth whose armor plating was so thick that standard German anti-tank weapons could not penetrate it under most combat conditions. German soldiers reported incidents where their shells struck KV-1 tanks and simply bounced away without causing any significant damage. The psychological impact of facing an apparently invulnerable enemy vehicle was profound. Infantry units that had grown accustomed to combined arms warfare, where they could rely on anti-tank guns and their own armoured vehicles to neutralise enemy tanks, suddenly found themselves helpless against these Soviet monsters. The realisation that their standard weapons were ineffective created a sense of vulnerability that spread through German units operating on the Eastern Front. The primary German anti-tank gun in the early war period was the 37mm Parquet 36. This weapon had been adequate for defeating the lightly armoured tanks that Germany faced in Poland and France. Against Soviet armour, it proved woefully inadequate. German soldiers, with bitter humour born of desperate circumstances, gave the weapon a nickname that captured its uselessness: the door knocker. The rounds it fired would impact Soviet armor with a loud metallic clang, announcing the presence of the German position much as a visitor might knock on a door, but without achieving any meaningful damage. The shells lacked the penetration power to breach the armor of T-34s and KV-1s, leaving German crews to watch helplessly as Soviet tanks rolled through their defensive positions, guns blazing, crushing equipment and personnel beneath their treads. The German military establishment responded to this crisis by rushing improved anti-tank guns into production. The 50mm Paquet-38 represented an upgrade in penetration capability, but even this weapon struggled against the most heavily armoured Soviet vehicles, particularly when engaging them from unfavourable angles or at longer ranges. German tank crews found themselves in a similar predicament. Many of their tanks mounted guns that were insufficiently powerful to reliably defeat Soviet armour. Engagements that should have resulted in quick German victories instead turned into prolonged exchanges where Soviet numerical superiority could be brought to bear. The strategic implications were severe. If German forces could not maintain their qualitative edge in anti-armor capability, the numerical advantages possessed by the Soviet Union would eventually prove decisive. Anti-tank rifles, which had once been considered effective weapons against light armor, became obsolete almost overnight. These weapons, which required considerable physical strength to operate and were cumbersome to transport, could damage vision blocks, tracks, or other external components of a tank, but they could no longer penetrate the main armor belt of modern Soviet tanks. The rounds simply lacked sufficient kinetic energy to breach the thickness of steel that protected crew compartments and vital systems. German infantry units equipped with these rifles found themselves carrying dead weight, weapons that offered little more than a false sense of security. Other anti-tank methods existed, but all of them required levels of courage that bordered on suicidal. Magnetic mines could be attached to the hull of a tank, but doing so required a soldier to approach within arm's reach of the vehicle, typically by crawling across open ground while under fire, then physically placing the explosive device against the armor while enemy machine guns swept the area. Even if successful, the soldier had only seconds to retreat before detonation, and the explosion itself often attracted concentrated fire on their position. Satchel charges and similar explosive devices faced the same fundamental problem. They required direct physical contact with the target, meaning the soldier had to expose themselves to point-blank defensive fire from the tank and its supporting infantry. The strategic situation demanded a new solution, something that could be distributed widely among infantry units, something that did not require specialized training or exceptional physical courage to employ, something cheap enough to be produced in the millions. German military planners and weapons designers began exploring options that could address these requirements. The answer they developed would not take the form of a larger artillery piece or a heavier tank. Instead, they would create a weapon of desperation, a device so simple in its construction that it could be manufactured by workshops and factories throughout the Reich, so cheap that losing one in combat represented a trivial economic cost, yet so deadly at close range that it could disable the most heavily armoured vehicles in the Soviet arsenal. Engineers began working on designs for a recoilless launching tube, a weapon system that would use principles that were well understood but had not been applied to anti-tank warfare in quite this fashion. The key innovation lay in the shaped charge warhead, a device that focused explosive energy into a narrow jet capable of melting through armor plating like a cutting torch through wax. The shaped charge principle had been known for decades, but applying it to a disposable, mass-produced infantry weapon required solving numerous engineering challenges. The weapon needed to be light enough for a single soldier to carry along with their other equipment. It needed to be simple enough that even hastily trained conscripts could use it effectively. It needed to be reliable under combat conditions, resistant to the shock and vibration of being transported in trucks or carried across rough terrain. Most importantly, it needed to be cheap, so inexpensive that the Reich could produce them by the millions without straining its already overstretched industrial capacity. For Germany, the development of this weapon represented far more than mere military innovation. It was about survival in the face of overwhelming opposition. Soviet offensives throughout 1942 and 1943 demonstrated that the Red Army was growing stronger, not weaker, as the war progressed. Soviet industrial capacity, particularly factories that had been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains, was producing tanks and artillery at rates that German industry could not match. The numerical imbalance was growing with each passing month. German military planners understood that unless they could find some way to multiply the effectiveness of their infantry, unless they could give ordinary soldiers the capability to destroy enemy tanks without requiring supporting armor or artillery, the Eastern Front would collapse. No amount of defensive preparation, no line of fortifications, no tactical brilliance could compensate for the simple arithmetic of Soviet numerical superiority, combined with qualitative parity or superiority in armored vehicles. The weapon that emerged from these requirements took the name Panzerfaust, which translates literally as armored fist, or more colloquially as tank fist. The name was deceptively aggressive for what was fundamentally a defensive weapon born from desperation. The Panzerfaust promised to transform ordinary infantry soldiers into tank killers, to give them the capability to engage and destroy armoured vehicles that had previously been the exclusive domain of anti-tank guns and other specialised weapons. The price for this capability was that soldiers would need to stand dangerously close to enemy armour, would need to expose themselves to concentrated defensive fire, would need to operate in an environment where survival was unlikely, regardless of whether their shot was successful. The physical design of the Panzerfaust reflected its disposable nature and the imperative of mass production. The main body consisted of a simple steel tube, drawn or welded from sheet metal using techniques that required minimal specialized machinery. The diameter of this tube varied between models, but the construction philosophy remained consistent. Use the simplest possible manufacturing methods to produce a lightweight, rigid launching platform. A wooden shoulder rest was attached to the rear of the tube, providing a surface for the operator to brace against their body. The trigger mechanism was equally primitive, consisting of a lever or bar that, when pressed or pulled, would mechanically strike a percussion cap or complete an electrical circuit to ignite the propellant charge. The warhead itself sat atop the tube rather than being loaded into it. This configuration allowed the warhead to be larger in diameter than the launching tube, maximizing the size of the shaped charge liner while keeping the launcher itself compact and manageable. The warhead consisted of an explosive charge surrounding a cone-shaped metal liner, typically made from copper due to its favorable properties for creating a penetrating jet upon detonation. When the warhead struck a target, a piezoelectric fuse in its nose would trigger the main explosive charge. This detonation would collapse the copper cone inward, transforming it from a solid piece of metal into a jet of molten and semi-molten particles traveling at several kilometers per second. This jet, though incredibly narrow, carried sufficient energy and momentum to punch through armor steel as if it were paper. The operation of the weapon was designed to be as simple as possible given the constraints of the technology. The propellant charge, typically black powder or a similar low-explosive compound, was preloaded into the launching tube during manufacturing. The weapon came ready to fire, requiring no loading procedure, no assembly, no preparation beyond removing it from its shipping crate or storage rack. An operator would position the weapon on their shoulder, using the crude sights or simply pointing the tube in the direction of the target. When the trigger was activated, the propellant charge would detonate inside the tube. Because the rear of the tube was open, the expanding gases would vent backward, creating the characteristic backblast while simultaneously accelerating the warhead forward. The principle of recoilless operation meant that the forward momentum of the warhead was balanced by the backward momentum of the propellant gases, resulting in minimal force transferred to the operator's shoulder. This backblast, however, represented one of the weapon's most dangerous characteristics for the operator. The expanding gases exiting the rear of the tube created a cone of lethal heat and pressure extending behind the firing position. Anyone standing within approximately 10 meters directly behind the weapon when it fired would be subjected to temperatures and pressures sufficient to cause severe burns or death. The visible signature of the backblast was equally problematic from a tactical perspective. The flash and smoke created by the propellant detonation would instantly reveal the shooter's position to every enemy soldier in the vicinity, making concealment after firing nearly impossible. German training materials included prominent warnings about the backblast danger, with phrases like Achtung Feuerstrahl painted on the tubes themselves, cautioning operators about the fiery jet that would erupt from the rear when firing. The true lethality of the system lay in the shaped charge warhead. Upon impact with a target, the piezoelectric fuse would function with remarkable reliability, even at the relatively low velocities at which the warhead travelled. The main explosive charge would detonate, and the physical principles governing shaped charge formation would take over. The copper liner would be transformed into a jet travelling at velocities that allowed it to behave more like a fluid than a solid, despite being metal. This jet would impact the surface of the armour plate and begin penetrating through it, not through kinetic energy alone, but through a combination of kinetic and hydrodynamic effects that allowed it to flow through the steel. The diameter of the hole created was relatively small, perhaps the width of a finger, but the consequences for the crew inside the tank were catastrophic. The penetrating jet would carry with it fragments of the armour plate itself, creating a spray of molten metal and high-velocity particles inside the crew compartment. This spray could kill or maim crew members, could detonate ammunition stored inside the tank, could damage critical systems like fuel lines or hydraulic systems. The first production model, designated Panzerfaust 30, carried a warhead with a diameter of approximately 100 mm and was rated for effective use at ranges up to 30 meters. The numerical designation referred to this nominal effective range, though in practice the accuracy of the weapon and the courage required to employ it effectively meant that most shots were fired at considerably closer distances. The penetration capability of the Panzerfaust 30 was sufficient to defeat the frontal armour of a T-34 medium tank, though shots against the thicker armour of heavy tanks or against especially well-protected areas might not achieve penetration. The weapon represented a compromise between effectiveness, manufacturability, and the willingness of soldiers to close to within 30 meters of an enemy tank. Recognizing that the battlefield situation demanded even greater destructive power, German engineers developed the Panzerfaust 30 Gross, or large Panzerfaust 30. This variant featured an enlarged warhead measuring approximately 150 mm in diameter. The increased size of the shaped charge liner allowed for greater penetration of armour, sufficient to threaten even the heaviest Soviet tanks then in service. The larger warhead did increase the overall weight of the weapon slightly, but it remained manageable for a single soldier to carry and employ. The effective range remained approximately 30 meters, as the ballistic properties of the larger warhead did not significantly change from the original model. By 1944, as the strategic situation continued to deteriorate for Germany, a new model entered production. The Panzerfaust 60 incorporated improvements in propellant design and warhead stabilization that allowed it to be employed effectively at ranges up to 60 meters. While this doubling of effective range might seem modest, it represented a significant improvement in the survivability prospects for the operator. Engaging a tank from 60 meters rather than 30 meters meant additional seconds to find cover after firing, meant being outside the most effective range of tank-mounted machine guns, meant having a slightly better chance of living through the engagement. The warhead of the Panzerfaust 60 retained the same diameter as the Gross model, maintaining its excellent armour penetration capability while extending the standoff distance. Production of the Panzerfaust 60 reached enormous scales. German factories, many of them operating under Allied bombing campaigns, many of them staffed by forced labourers and concentration camp prisoners, churned out these weapons by the millions. Every front received allocations, every infantry unit, every fortress garrison, every rear area security formation received crates of Panzerfausts. The weapon became ubiquitous, as common as rifles or hand grenades, distributed with the expectation that every soldier might need to engage enemy armour at some point. Training in its use was incorporated into basic infantry instruction, though the quality and thoroughness of this training declined as the war progressed and Germany became increasingly desperate for manpower. The evolution of the Panzerfaust continued with the introduction of the Panzerfaust 100 model. This variant represented a significant redesign, incorporating lessons learned from combat employment of earlier models. The warhead mass increased to approximately 6 kilograms, with corresponding improvements in penetration capability. Tests indicated that the Panzerfaust 100 could penetrate armor plates over 220 mm thick, sufficient to defeat virtually any tank in service with Allied or Soviet forces. The propellant charge was increased to provide additional range, with the weapon theoretically capable of being employed at distances up to 100 meters. In practice, the accuracy of the weapon at such ranges was marginal, and most operators continued to fire at much closer distances where the likelihood of a hit was higher. In the final months of the war, as Germany teetered on the brink of total collapse, engineers developed the Panzerfaust 150. This model represented the culmination of the Panzerfaust design philosophy, incorporating a sleek aerodynamic warhead shape that improved flight characteristics. A two-stage propellant system provided better control over the launch sequence, reducing dispersion and improving accuracy. The armor penetration exceeded 300 mm, making it capable of defeating even hypothetical future tanks with armor thickness beyond anything currently in service. The effective range reached 150 meters, finally providing a standoff distance that gave operators a reasonable chance of surviving an engagement. However, the Panzerfaust 150 arrived too late and in too few numbers to make any strategic difference. German industry was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing, Soviet advances were cutting off raw materials and manufacturing centers, and the transportation network necessary to distribute weapons to frontline units was disintegrating. Plans existed for even more advanced versions. The Panzerfaust 250 was designed as a reloadable system, abandoning the disposable philosophy of earlier models in favor of a weapon that could be used multiple times. The launcher would have incorporated a modern sighting system and improved ergonomics. However, these plans never progressed beyond the drawing board and prototype stage. Germany's industrial capacity was too degraded, the Reich's territorial losses too severe, and time too short for such developments to reach production. The Panzerfaust 250 remained a glimpse of what might have been, a weapon that could have been genuinely effective if it had appeared earlier in the war and been produced in sufficient quantities. Each successive model of the Panzerfaust was more powerful than the last. Each represented an attempt to give German infantry a fighting chance against overwhelming armoured opposition, and each carried the same fundamental curse. To use any version of the Panzerfaust effectively required a soldier to position themselves within the shadow of an enemy tank, to remain steady while machine gun fire tore through the air around them, to control their fear long enough to aim and squeeze the trigger, all while knowing that their chances of survival were minimal, regardless of whether their shot succeeded. The weapon was not merely a piece of engineering, it was a physical manifestation of desperation. A tool that asked its users to gamble their lives for a small chance at destroying a single enemy vehicle. The tactical employment of the Panzerfaust evolved through battlefield experience and institutional learning. The first shipments reached frontline units on the Eastern Front in September 1943, distributed among infantry formations that had spent months battling Soviet armor with inadequate weapons. When soldiers opened the crates and examined these new weapons, many were skeptical. The crude appearance, the simple construction, the warnings about backblast danger all suggested that this was yet another desperate improvisation rather than a genuine solution to their problems. However, skepticism gave way to cautious optimism once the weapons were employed in combat and soldiers witnessed their effectiveness firsthand. The basic tactic emerged organically from the operational constraints and capabilities of the weapon. Small teams of infantry, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, would position themselves in concealment along routes where enemy armor was expected to advance. Ruins of buildings provided ideal positions, offering firing ports from upper floors or basements, providing cover from retaliatory fire, and allowing multiple escape routes if the position became untenable. These teams would wait in absolute silence as the sound of approaching tanks grew louder. The ground would begin to vibrate with the rhythmic grinding of tracks on pavement or earth. The smell of diesel exhaust would permeate the air. Through small openings in rubble or from behind improvised firing positions, the hunters would watch as Soviet tanks rolled into the killing zone. Patience was critical. Firing too early, when the tank was still at longer range, increased the likelihood of a miss and revealed the position without achieving any result. The team had to wait until the optimal moment, when the tank had closed to within effective range and when its most vulnerable aspects were exposed. Tank armor was not uniform in thickness. The frontal plates were typically the thickest, designed to resist direct fire from anti-tank guns. The side armor was thinner, a necessary compromise to keep the total weight of the vehicle manageable. The rear armor was often the thinnest of all, as designers assumed the tank would rarely be struck from behind during offensive operations. A Panzerfaust shot against the frontal armor might penetrate, but the same shot against the side or rear was virtually guaranteed to achieve a kill. When the moment came, when the tank had moved into the optimal position, one man would steady the Panzerfaust on his shoulder, sight through the crude aiming mechanism, and press the trigger. The weapon would roar, the backblast would fill the confined space with fire and smoke, and the warhead would lance across the intervening distance to strike the tank's hull. If the shot was true, the results were immediate and devastating. The shaped charge would penetrate the armor, spraying the interior with molten metal fragments. Ammunition stowage might detonate in a catastrophic secondary explosion. Fuel tanks might rupture and ignite. Even if these secondary effects did not occur, the crew would be killed or severely wounded by the initial penetration. However, success in destroying the tank did not guarantee survival for the Panzerfaust team. The backblast had revealed their position as surely as if they had fired a signal flare. Every enemy soldier in the area now knew where the attack had originated. Supporting infantry accompanying the tanks would direct suppressive fire at the suspected position. Other tanks in the column would traverse their turrets and machine guns, hosing down the area with concentrated fire. The moments after firing were the most dangerous. The team had to abandon their position immediately, using whatever covered routes were available to escape the area before overwhelming firepower was brought to bear. Sometimes they succeeded, disappearing into the urban landscape or retreating through pre-planned withdrawal routes. Often they did not, cut down by machine gun fire before they could take more than a few steps, or killed when the position they had occupied moments before was obliterated by high-explosive shells. These teams came to be known as Panzerjäger Commandos or Panzer Commandos, tank hunter teams. Their missions were among the most dangerous that infantry could undertake, requiring a combination of patience, courage, and ruthlessness. Lives depended on split-second timing and absolute precision. Fire too early and the shot might miss, wasting the weapon and revealing the position for no gain. Fire too late, and the tank's defensive weapons would have already detected and engaged the team. The psychological stress was immense. Waiting in silence as multi-ton vehicles approached, knowing that within minutes you would either be dead or fleeing for your life, tested the limits of human endurance. The tactic proved effective despite its brutality. The economic equation was overwhelmingly favourable from a purely material standpoint. A Panzerfaust cost perhaps a few Reichsmarks to manufacture. A Soviet T-34 tank represented months of factory labour, tons of steel and other strategic materials, complex manufacturing processes, and significant transportation costs to move it from the factory to the front. Destroying a tank with a Panzerfaust meant trading something nearly worthless for something extraordinarily valuable. Of course, this cold calculation ignored the human cost, the lives of the soldiers who wielded the weapons, but in total war economics, human lives were treated as just another resource to be expended in pursuit of military objectives. By 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy and began their advance into France, the Panzerfaust had spread from the Eastern Front to every theatre where German forces operated. The bocage country of Normandy, with its maze of hedgerows, sunken lanes and small fields, proved to be ideal terrain for Panzerfaust ambushes. Allied armour advancing through these confined spaces found itself vulnerable to close-range attack from weapons hidden in the dense vegetation. Sherman tanks and Churchill tanks, designed to operate in more open terrain where their superior numbers and firepower could be brought to bear, discovered that their advantages meant little when a single soldier with a Panzerfaust could appear from a hedgerow at point-blank range. Allied tank crews developed a profound respect and fear for the weapon. Reports and after-action analyses from the Normandy campaign indicate that approximately one-third of tank losses in that theatre can be attributed to Panzerfausts and similar infantry anti-tank weapons. This was a staggering proportion, higher than losses from German tanks or anti-tank guns. The psychological impact was significant. Crew members knew that they could be engaged and destroyed at any moment, with little or no warning. The snap of ignition, the whoosh of the warhead in flight, and the thunderous impact might be the last sounds they ever heard. This constant threat shaped Allied tactical doctrine. Infantry support became mandatory when operating in close terrain. Tanks that advanced without infantry to clear potential ambush positions were considered to be on suicide missions. Urban warfare transformed the Panzerfaust from a dangerous weapon into an absolute nightmare for armoured forces. Cities and towns created environments where every building could conceal a tank hunter, where every alley and street corner could hide a firing position, where the advantages of armour mobility and firepower were negated by terrain that forced vehicles into predictable routes. In the brutal fighting for Warsaw during the 1944 uprising, in the grinding urban combat through Aachen and other German cities, and eventually in the apocalyptic battle for Berlin itself, tanks became death traps when they entered without adequate infantry screening. Defenders would position themselves in upper-story windows, in basements with clear fields of fire onto streets, in ruins where they could engage the thinner top armour of tanks as they passed below. The technique of firing down onto tanks was particularly effective because the top armour was invariably the thinnest on the vehicle, designed primarily to protect against shell fragments and shrapnel rather than direct anti-tank fire. A Panzerfaust fired from an upper-story window down onto the engine deck or turret top had an excellent chance of achieving a catastrophic kill. The tank crew, focused on threats at ground level, might never even see the attack coming. Allied soldiers began referring to the Panzerfaust as the ghost weapon, a name that captured the terror of facing an enemy that could strike without warning and disappear just as quickly. You never saw the person who fired. There was no muzzle flash to provide warning as there would be with an anti-tank gun. The first indication of an attack was often the sound of the propellant ignition, a sharp crack that might provide a fraction of a second of warning, followed immediately by the impact and detonation of the warhead. Sometimes the first sign was simply the catastrophic explosion as a friendly tank erupted in flames. The survivor accounts from tank crews describe the visceral terror of this experience, the helplessness of knowing that at any moment an unseen enemy could end their lives, the constant anxiety that accompanied any movement through terrain that offered concealment to potential attackers. Tank crews attempted to develop countermeasures and protective measures. Some units began welding spare track links to the exterior of their tanks, creating an additional layer of steel that might detonate a shaped charge prematurely or cause it to form less effectively. Logs were strapped to hulls in an attempt to create standoff distance between the warhead and the primary armour. Bed frames, mesh screens and sandbags were all pressed into service as improvised protection. However, none of these measures provided reliable protection. A shaped charge that functioned properly could penetrate through these improvised shields and still defeat the main armour belt. At best, these additions might cause a small percentage of attacks to fail, might provide psychological comfort to the crew, but they could not eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. Tactical doctrine underwent rapid evolution in response to the Panzerfaust threat. The principle that emerged and became doctrine was simple. No armour into cities or close terrain without infantry cover, no exceptions. Infantry soldiers were tasked with clearing buildings room by room, checking every potential firing position, forcing any tank hunters to reveal themselves before the armour entered the danger zone. This doctrine was sound in theory but difficult to execute in practice. Urban combat consumed infantry at an alarming rate. Casualties mounted as soldiers had to expose themselves repeatedly while clearing buildings. Units that started an urban assault with adequate infantry strength might find themselves with insufficient numbers to provide effective screening after days or weeks of continuous combat. When infantry strength became inadequate, commanders faced the choice of committing armour without proper support or abandoning the advance, neither of which was an acceptable option in the context of total war. On the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders had even more bitter experience with the Panzerfaust. Soviet tactical doctrine emphasized mass-armored assaults, waves of tanks advancing in coordination to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and firepower. This doctrine had proven effective in many contexts, but it played directly into the strengths of the Panzerfaust. German defenders in cities and fortified positions would allow Soviet armour to close to point-blank range, then unleash simultaneous attacks from multiple positions. A single coordinated ambush might destroy a dozen or more tanks in minutes, leaving burning hulks scattered across a street or square. Soviet casualty reports and post-war analyses indicated that as much as 70% of tank losses on the Eastern Front during 1944 and 1945 came not from German tanks or anti-tank guns, but from infantry-carried weapons like the Panzerfaust. This was a staggering reversal of the normal pattern where most armour losses came from other armoured vehicles or from dedicated anti-tank systems. The prevalence of the Panzerfaust forced Soviet commanders to completely rethink their approach to urban operations and to combined arms warfare more generally. Infantry support became absolutely mandatory. Engineer units were tasked with breaching routes through cities that avoided the most dangerous kill zones. Artillery bombardments became heavier and more prolonged, attempting to suppress or eliminate potential Panzerfaust positions before armour was committed. The terror of the Panzerfaust in deployment stemmed not from set-piece battles or from long-range duels between opposing forces, but from the intimate violence of ambush warfare. It was a weapon of alleys and hedgerows, of ruined buildings and urban rubble, of situations where survival depended more on chance than skill. It forced the armies of industrial superpowers to acknowledge that the humble infantryman, armed with a crude tube and a shaped charge, could still be a decisive factor in warfare despite all the technological advancement that tanks represented. Every ruined street became a potential trap. Every advance into close terrain became a calculated risk. The Panzerfaust transformed urban environments into nightmares for armoured forces, proving that even the most overwhelming technological superiority could be negated by the proper tactical conditions and weapons. As 1945 arrived and Germany's situation transitioned from desperate to hopeless, the nature of Panzerfaust deployment underwent a transformation that was tragic in both its scope and its implications. The Reich was collapsing under the weight of attacks from east, west, and south. Soviet forces had pushed deep into German territory, capturing city after city, driving millions of refugees westward. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine and were advancing into the industrial heartland. Italy had long since been lost. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, unable to contest Allied air supremacy. The Kriegsmarine had been reduced to operating U-boats on suicide missions. What remained of German military power was concentrated in scattered army groups, isolated fortress cities, and the will to resist despite the inevitability of defeat. In this context of national catastrophe, the Nazi regime made a decision that would condemn hundreds of thousands to death. The Volkssturm, the People's Storm, was officially established as a last-ditch militia force comprising all males aged 16 to 60 who had not already been conscripted into the Wehrmacht. This was not a professional military force. These were not trained soldiers. The Volkssturm included teenage boys whose understanding of war came primarily from propaganda, elderly men whose last experience of combat might have been in the trenches of the First World War, workers from factories, clerks from offices, teachers, shopkeepers, anyone who could be pressed into service. Their equipment was whatever could be scraped together from depleted arsenals and improvised from civilian sources. Some received old rifles captured from defeated enemies or obsolete weapons pulled from storage. Some received nothing but armbands, identifying them as combatants under the Geneva Convention, a legal nicety that would mean nothing when they faced enemy soldiers in the chaos of combat. What they did receive in abundance were Panzerfausts. Millions of these disposable anti-tank weapons were distributed to Volkssturm units with minimal training in their use. A boy of 16 might receive an hour of instruction, perhaps not even that, before being sent to a defensive position with orders to stop Soviet tanks. The scenes that unfolded in German cities during the final months of the war defy easy description. In Berlin, in Vienna, in Königsberg, in Dresden, in dozens of other cities and towns, these makeshift soldiers took up positions in the ruins of their homes and neighborhoods. A child who should have been in school now stood at a street corner, the weight of a Panzerfaust in his thin arms almost too much to bear. The steel tube was cold to the touch, its painted warnings about backblast a grim reminder that using this weapon might kill him even if the enemy didn't. Across the avenue, the rumble of approaching tanks could be heard, could be felt through the ground, a mechanical grinding that announced the arrival of forces against which he had no chance. When the moment came, when the Soviet tank rolled into view, the boy would raise the Panzerfaust to his shoulder. His hands might shake. His breathing might be rapid and shallow. Every instinct would scream at him to run, to hide, to do anything except stand exposed in the open with this weapon. But orders were orders, and the propaganda had told him that this was his duty, that he was defending the fatherland against Bolshevik hordes, that his sacrifice had meaning. He would sight along the tube, trying to steady his aim despite his trembling, and pull the trigger. The backblast would envelop him in fire and smoke. If he had positioned himself correctly, if he had remembered to ensure there was no wall or obstruction behind him, he might survive this initial burst. The warhead would fly toward its target, and for a fleeting moment there existed the possibility of success. Sometimes the shot was true. Sometimes the shaped charge would strike the tank's hull and penetrate, creating the kind of catastrophic damage that could disable or destroy the vehicle. In those moments, the impossible seemed real. A child armed with a crude weapon had brought down a machine that embodied industrial might and military power. But then reality would reassert itself. The tank's turret would swing toward the source of the attack. Machine guns would open fire, their rate of fire so high that the sound blurred into a continuous roar rather than distinct shots. Bullets would tear through the air at velocities that made them invisible, their passage marked only by the destruction they caused as they struck walls, pavement, and human bodies. The boy might try to run, might try to take cover, might realize in his final moments that he had been sent to die in a war that was already lost. His war would end before it had truly begun, his body left lying in the rubble, still clutching the empty Panzerfaust tube. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across Germany in the spring of 1945. In every contested city, in every village that became a battlefield, makeshift soldiers emerged from doorways and ruins to face armoured vehicles at point-blank range. The effectiveness of their attacks varied wildly. Some struck true, achieving kills that professional soldiers would have been proud of. Many more missed their targets, the warheads flying wide or striking at angles that prevented penetration. But whether successful or not, the outcome for the shooter was often the same. Machine gun fire would sweep the area. Tank crews and supporting infantry, enraged by the attack and by months or years of brutal combat, would systematically search for and eliminate anyone who might have been involved. Allied forces, particularly Soviet troops, who had fought their way across thousands of miles of hostile territory and witnessed countless atrocities, showed little mercy to Panzerfaust-equipped defenders. When a tank was struck, the response was often to saturate the entire area with fire, using heavy machine guns and the tank's main gun to destroy any structure that might conceal an attacker. Buildings would collapse under this barrage. Positions that might have provided cover became tombs as walls and ceilings gave way. The few survivors who managed to escape would often be hunted down in the aftermath, combat giving way to summary executions as soldiers sought revenge for fallen comrades. Allied soldiers began to recognize a pattern in these engagements: the sudden blast of a Panzerfaust firing, the impact on a tank, sometimes achieving a kill, sometimes merely scoring the armor. And then, as they moved forward to secure the area, they would find the body of the attacker. Often it was a boy, sometimes barely into his teens, still gripping the empty launcher tube. Sometimes it was an elderly man, his grey hair and weathered face at odds with the weapon in his hands. These discoveries troubled even hardened combat veterans. They were fighting against what appeared to be children and grandfathers, people who should never have been on a battlefield, people who had been sent to die by a regime that valued their lives only insofar as they could delay the inevitable defeat. The propaganda of the Nazi regime spoke of heroism, of citizens rising to defend the fatherland against foreign invaders, of glorious sacrifice in service of the nation. Newspapers and radio broadcasts that still functioned carried stories of Volkssturm members destroying enemy tanks, of boys becoming men through their courage under fire. The reality was far removed from these sanitized narratives. This was not heroism, but tragedy, not willing sacrifice, but murder by a regime that had lost all moral authority. Germany was consuming its own future, sending children who should have been learning and growing into combat situations where survival was nearly impossible. The calculus was brutal and simple. Each Volkssturm member armed with a Panzerfaust represented perhaps a 1% chance of destroying an enemy tank, but a 90% chance of dying in the attempt. From a pure military standpoint, this might have seemed acceptable if one considered only the material exchange. Trading a few Reichsmarks worth of weapon and a life the regime considered expendable for a tank worth tens of thousands of rubles and the lives of its crew could be justified in the cold mathematics of total war. But this ignored the human cost, ignored the fact that these were not professional soldiers who had chosen military service, but civilians pressed into a losing battle. The final weeks of the war saw some of the most intense urban combat in history as Soviet forces fought their way into Berlin. The Panzerfaust became ubiquitous in this battle, with tens of thousands distributed to Wehrmacht remnants and Volkssturm units defending the ruins of the capital. Every street became a potential ambush site. Every ruined building could conceal a tank hunter. Soviet armor advancing into the city faced a gauntlet of fire, with Panzerfaust attacks coming from all directions and all elevations. The losses were significant. Soviet tank brigades that entered the city at near full strength emerged decimated, having left dozens of burned-out hulks scattered through the streets of Berlin. Yet these tactical successes, if they can be called that, achieved nothing of strategic value. The war was already lost. No amount of destroyed Soviet tanks would change the outcome. Germany had neither the industrial capacity to replace its losses nor the manpower to sustain prolonged resistance. The Battle of Berlin resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties, military and civilian, including countless Volkssturm members who died wielding Panzerfausts against overwhelming opposition. Their deaths brought nothing except a few additional days before the inevitable surrender. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, when the last shots had been fired and the last surrenders accepted, the landscape of Europe was littered with the detritus of war. Among this wreckage were millions of Panzerfaust tubes, some fired and discarded, others never used, left in crates or scattered across defensive positions. For Allied soldiers, particularly those who had faced the weapon in combat, these empty tubes represented grim souvenirs, physical reminders of how close death had stalked them during the advance into Germany. Many took them home as trophies, as teaching aids, as objects to contemplate when trying to explain to family members what the war had been like. The Panzerfaust itself was finished as an active weapon system. Germany had been defeated and occupied, its military dissolved, its industrial capacity redirected toward reconstruction. But the weapon's influence was only beginning to spread. Soviet engineers who had captured numerous examples during their advance westward examined them with great interest. The simplicity of the design, the effectiveness of the shaped charge, the recoilless principle that made it manageable for infantry all suggested applications for future weapons development. Within 4 years of the war's end, the Soviet Union introduced the RPG-2, a reloadable rocket-propelled grenade launcher that drew heavily on lessons learned from examining Panzerfausts. The RPG-2 retained the basic concept of a shoulder-fired shaped-charge anti-armor weapon, but addressed many of the Panzerfaust's limitations. It used a rocket motor to propel the warhead, rather than relying on a simple propellant charge, providing greater range and accuracy. It was reloadable, allowing a single launcher to be used multiple times rather than being discarded after one shot. The warhead design was refined based on Soviet research into shaped charges, improving penetration and reliability. This weapon system would go on to spawn an entire family of rocket-propelled grenades, including the famous RPG-7, which became one of the most widely produced and distributed weapons in human history. The legacy of the Panzerfaust extended beyond Soviet weapons development. NATO forces and other Western militaries also studied the weapon and incorporated lessons from it into their own anti-tank systems. The principle that infantry needed effective portable anti-armor weapons became enshrined in military doctrine. The development of weapons like the American M72 LAW and later systems like the Carl Gustav and Javelin can all trace conceptual lineage back to the insights gained from examining the Panzerfaust. The idea that a relatively cheap, simple weapon carried by infantry could threaten expensive, sophisticated armoured vehicles became a permanent feature of military thinking. For the Allied armies, the lessons learned from facing the Panzerfaust in combat had immediate and lasting impacts on doctrine and tactics. The principle that tanks could no longer operate independently, that armour required infantry support at all times when operating in close terrain, became dogma. Training programs incorporated scenarios where tank crews had to work closely with infantry to clear potential Panzerfaust positions. Armour design began to emphasize protection against shaped charges, leading to developments like spaced armour, reactive armour, and eventually active protection systems. The comfortable assumption that tanks were invulnerable to individual infantry soldiers had been shattered, and that realization shaped military thinking for decades to come. The weapon's legacy appears in modern insurgencies and asymmetric conflicts around the world. Wherever a technologically inferior force faces an opponent with superior armoured vehicles, the shadow of the Panzerfaust can be seen. The RPG has become the weapon of choice for guerrilla forces, insurgents, and irregular troops precisely because it embodies the same principle that made the Panzerfaust effective. It allows a single person with minimal training and equipment to challenge or destroy an armoured vehicle worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Chechnya to the Middle East, the conceptual descendant of the Panzerfaust continues to shape how wars are fought. In museums today, preserved Panzerfausts sit in climate-controlled display cases, their steel tubes corroded, their paint faded, rendered completely inert by the removal of propellants and explosives. They appear almost harmless now, relics from another era, difficult to connect with the terror they once inspired. Museum plaques describe their technical specifications, their production numbers, their historical context. But these sanitized displays cannot fully convey what the weapon represented to those who used it or faced it. They cannot capture the fear of a tank crew hearing the snap hiss of a Panzerfaust firing from an unseen position. They cannot communicate the desperate courage or the tragic futility of a 16-year-old boy standing against a tank. They are merely objects now, divorced from the human experiences that gave them meaning. The shadow of the Panzerfaust extends long across the decades since its use. It is the ancestor of modern shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, the proof of concept that shaped charges could be miniaturized and made portable while retaining lethal effectiveness. It taught military theorists and weapons designers that asymmetry in warfare could be achieved through technological means, that the relationship between cost and effectiveness did not have to favor expensive, sophisticated systems. A weapon costing a few Reichsmarks could destroy a tank costing thousands. This economic calculation, once demonstrated, could never be unlearned. For the German nation, the aftermath of the Panzerfaust's use carried a particularly bitter taste. The weapon had not saved the Reich. It had not stopped the Soviet advance or the Allied liberation of Western Europe. All it had done was prolong the inevitable end, purchasing a few additional weeks or months of war at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The decision to arm the Volkssturm with Panzerfausts, to send children and the elderly into combat against tanks, stands as one of the many crimes of the Nazi regime. These were not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were civilians pressed into service by a government that viewed them as expendable resources, no different from ammunition or fuel. The cold arithmetic of the weapon's effectiveness measured success in terms of tanks destroyed, a metric that ignored the human beings who had to wield it. For every T-34 or Sherman immobilized by a Panzerfaust strike, there was often a German soldier or Volkssturm member lying dead nearby. The weapon's very effectiveness at destroying tanks created a false impression that it was a solution to Germany's strategic problems, when in reality it was merely a symptom of how desperate the situation had become. Nations that have sufficient tanks and anti-tank guns do not arm their civilians with disposable rocket launchers and send them against enemy armor. In historical retrospect, the Panzerfaust stands as a symbol of the extremes to which total war can drive nations. It represents ingenuity applied under pressure, the kind of innovation that emerges when survival is at stake and conventional solutions have failed. The engineering behind the shaped charge, the recoilless principle, the disposable design all demonstrated sophisticated understanding of physics and materials science. German engineers solved complex problems with elegant, simple solutions. Yet this same ingenuity was placed in service of a regime whose war aims were fundamentally criminal, whose ideology celebrated conquest and genocide, whose leadership was willing to sacrifice an entire generation to delay defeat. The weapon embodies a paradox that runs through much of military history. Technology can be brilliant, effective, even revolutionary in its applications, yet when wielded in the service of immoral causes or desperate circumstances, it becomes a tool of tragedy. The Panzerfaust worked, it destroyed tanks, it fulfilled its design parameters admirably. But what did that success cost? It cost the lives of boys who should have been in school, of men who should have been at home with their families, of soldiers who found themselves in impossible tactical situations because their leadership had sent them to fight a war that was already lost. The question that haunts the legacy of the Panzerfaust is whether it represents a triumph of innovation or a monument to futility. Was it a weapon that levelled the playing field between infantry and armour, or was it a device that consumed those who used it as surely as it destroyed the targets it struck? The answer resists simple formulation. From a purely technical standpoint, the Panzerfaust was a remarkable achievement, a weapon that punched far above its weight class and forced opponents to completely rethink their tactical approaches. From a human standpoint, it was an instrument of tragedy, a tool that enabled a dying regime to extract a final measure of sacrifice from people who deserved better than to be thrown against tanks with crude weapons and minimal training. The answer to what the Panzerfaust truly was perhaps lies not only in counting the tanks it destroyed, but in remembering the voices that were silenced beneath the roar of its blast. The statistics of its effectiveness, the millions produced, the thousands of armoured vehicles it disabled, these numbers tell one story. But there is another story written in the lives interrupted, the families destroyed, the futures erased. Every tank destroyed represented a tactical success that might buy a few hours or days. Every life lost using the weapon represented a tragedy that could never be undone. Both realities coexist in the historical record, impossible to separate, impossible to reconcile. What remains is a weapon that changed how wars are fought, that demonstrated principles that continue to influence military technology and doctrine, yet also a weapon whose use exemplified the depths of desperation and the human cost of total war. The Panzerfaust tube may be silent now in museum displays, but its echoes continue to resound through conflicts around the world, where asymmetric warfare pits individuals armed with portable weapons against the armoured might of nation-states. Its legacy is both technical and cautionary, a reminder of what humans can create when pressed to the limits, and a warning about the costs of the choices made in warfare. The ruined streets of Berlin, of Warsaw, of Aachen, and dozens of other cities bear silent witness to what transpired when this weapon was deployed en masse. The scars have healed on the surface, buildings rebuilt, populations regrown, the physical damage repaired. But the historical memory remains, preserved in photographs, in survivor accounts, in the records of units that faced the weapon or were equipped with it. These sources tell us that the Panzerfaust was never just another piece of equipment, never merely a tool in the arsenal of a nation at war. It was the physical manifestation of desperation, meeting innovation, of a regime willing to sacrifice everything and everyone in a futile attempt to forestall defeat, of the extremes to which total war can drive human societies when rational calculation gives way to ideological fervour and the refusal to accept inevitable outcomes.